Hey there, it's Shannon Ballard. Southern Mysteries is an independent podcast made possible by the support of patrons like you who help me continue to share stories like the one you'll hear today. I appreciate all of my patrons, including my newest members. Thanks to Brenda Dockery from Salem, Alabama, and to Shauna Moser-Meese, Caitlin, and Paula Miller, who are listening and supporting from a mysterious location. When you join these very kind folks in supporting the show on Patreon, you can hear ad-free episodes and the show archive of the first 3 seasons. You can also join at a level where you have access to a lot of bonus content, like the archives of patron-exclusive podcast and the patron-exclusive monthly podcast, Audacious, Tales of Scandalous and Shocking Crimes in American History. There are 2 tiers, 2 options to join on Patreon, and it's really easy to opt in and out because we all know our financial situation can change. So I encourage you to just check it out. And if you join today, you can start listening to episodes you haven't heard before at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. Coxton is a small coal mining town in central Harlan County, Kentucky. In the 1930s, Harlan County made national headlines due to deadly battles between coal companies and union organizers. But little Coxton, Kentucky, situated in the valley of the Clover Fork of the Cumberland River, was often named in national papers between 1925 to 1927, following the disappearance and murder of 14-year-old Mary Vickery. A prime suspect was arrested and eventually tried, convicted, and sentenced to life for Mary's murder. But in the spring of 1927, a young woman stepped off the train in Harlan County to deliver information to authorities that would free the man convicted of this crime. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is the curious case of Condy Dabney. 14-year-old Mary Vickery disappeared on a sweltering summer day in Coxton, Kentucky. On August 17, 1925, Mary joined sisters Goldie and Mary Stewart for a stroll from Coxton toward the Stewarts' grandparents' home. On the way back to town, the trio were pleased when a young man named Will Middleton came along in his car and offered them a ride. They accepted, and Will dropped the 3 girls off at the bridge in Coxton. Goldie and Mary Stewart walked on, but Mary Vickery lingered a bit, talking to Will Middleton. Mary Vickery never made it home that night. Early the next morning, her father, E.C. Vickery, met with Harlan County Sheriff J.H. Blair to report the disappearance of his oldest child. Mr. Vickery described his daughter Mary as short, heavy-set, with sandy-colored, bobbed hair and blue eyes. She was last seen wearing a black and white striped dress, black patent leather slippers, and brown stockings. When asked how things were at home, Mr. Vickery shared that Mary's mother had died when Mary was 2, and she and her 4 siblings had been raised by their stepmother, Nellie. The relationship between all of them could be tense at times, but it was especially strained between Mary and Nellie. Mr. Vickery insisted, despite the tension at home, there was no way Mary would have run off on her own. Sheriff Blair traced Mary Vickery's movements from the time she left home the day before, and after speaking with the Stewart sisters, he arrested the only suspect in Mary's disappearance, Will Middleton. When Will was questioned by the sheriff, he explained he was innocent and said his brother-in-law, Otis King, could back him up. Otis was in the car with Will when they had given those girls a ride, and he backed up Will Middleton's claim that all 3 girls had been dropped off at the bridge in Coxton. He said Mary had lingered to chat with Will for about 5 minutes after the Stewart sisters departed, but she had left, and they saw her head toward home. Otis King also backed up Will Middleton's story that as they got on the road, they had to stop within about 15 minutes because they had a flat tire. Otis explained that as they were on the roadside fixing that tire, they watched as a man drove by in a Ford sedan, and inside that car, they saw Mary Vickery, who waved at them as the car drove on. The sheriff asked for a description of the man driving that vehicle, but Otis King and Will Middleton said they never saw his face. They just knew it was Mary inside because she waved at them, and both of them remembered the little girl in the car was wearing a black and white dress. Sheriff Blair and his deputies started calling on neighbors all along the mountain road where Will and Otis claimed to see Mary Vickery in that Ford sedan. Those calls led them to a young Miss Smith, who told the sheriff she saw a girl in a black and white dress in a Ford that had driven by that afternoon. She remembered details about that car that Otis and Will couldn't, such as the Ford having a little long glass window in the rear and a spare tire on the back. And she pointed out that on the front axle, there was a little sign that read, "Taxi." Sheriff Blair immediately had another suspect because there was only one Ford taxicab that ran between Coxton and Harlan. It was owned and driven by 30-year-old Condy Dabney. The married father of two had moved to Harlan County from Coal Creek, Tennessee, 2 months earlier to look for work. He found a job in the coal mines and was said to be a very hard worker. Condy Dabney had a respectable reputation in town, and he had also remained faithful to his wife after promising her he would never fool around while they were living in different states. After 2 months of working in the mines, Dabney noticed a way he could escape coal mining. He'd seen a lot of people in the area walking to get where they needed to go, so he saved up enough cash to buy a Ford sedan and launched a taxi service, which was the right decision. He had plenty of business, especially at the train depot in Harlan, where he picked up most of his fares. When Sheriff Blair heard the Ford sedan Mary Vickery had last been seen in was driven by a man with a taxi sign on the car, he immediately headed to the train depot, where he found Condy Dabney waiting for his next fare. Sheriff Blair arrested a shocked and very confused Condy Dabney, who kept denying he knew this Mary Vickery. He explained she may have been a paying passenger, but of the women who had hired him recently, he couldn't remember any of them by name. Despite his denials, Condy Dabney was held in jail until the next grand jury met, at which time the jury decided there was little to no evidence to indict him, and he was released from jail. Despite being free, folks in the area didn't trust him anymore. Condy Dabney tried to resume his taxi business, but many of his best customers refused to ride with him, especially women. He lost so much business, he tried to get a job in the coal mine again, but no one in Harlan County would hire him. Condy Dabney left the county and returned home to his family in Tennessee. Mary Vickery remained a missing person until October 15th, when the hunt for a moonshine still in the mountains above Coxton led authorities to an abandoned mine shaft known as Bugger Hollow Mine. As he stepped inside, U.S. Marshal Adrian Metcalf stumbled on bones. He immediately called in county officials who confirmed Metcalf had found a complete human skeleton of a young person between the ages of 12 to 14. The skull was badly crushed, indicating the victim had been beaten to death. The victim was brunette, and there were brown Oxfords, brown stockings, peach-colored underclothes, and a black coat on the body, but no dress. The coroner asked Mary Vickery's father to view items found with the remains to try to determine whether these were the remains of his daughter. When he saw a little ring authorities had found at the scene, he held up the red stone ring and mentioned he had bought it for Mary in Knoxville on her birthday, June 4th. Mary's father said he had no way of knowing if the body was his daughter's. He only knew this was her ring. The coroner ruled Mary Vickery had been found deceased, but could not make a final determination as to how the young girl died. Now, there was talk around town and among investigators about the odd behavior of Mary's family. Her father didn't seem fazed when he was called in to identify those articles found with the remains, which led to confirmation of his daughter's death. Mr. Vickery was struggling to support his family and had no money to bury his daughter. The county agreed to cover the expense, but in a strange turn, the Vickery family did not attend Mary's funeral. Harlan County Sheriff Blair had one suspect, Condy Dabney. The sheriff drove to Dabney's home in Coal Creek, Tennessee, where he arrested him and charged him with first-degree murder. Sheriff Blair and fellow investigators went back to the beginning to help county attorneys try to build their case against Condy Dabney. That's because they realized the Commonwealth didn't have a very strong case to take to the grand jury. Mary's father admitted he had no way of knowing if the body found in the mine shaft was his daughter's. The shoes found on the remains were brown, but Mary was last seen wearing black shoes that matched her black and white dress. That dress was not found at the crime scene. The sheriff followed up on Condy Dabney's movements on August 17th, the day of Mary Vickery's disappearance. Dabney, who was living in Coxton at the time, boarded with a man named Tom Pope. Pope told the sheriff Dabney had breakfast at the boarding house on the morning of August 17th, but he did not eat meals on the 18th. Now, the owner did confirm he saw Condy Dabney at breakfast on August 19th. He also confirmed Dabney was seen daily in the house until August 29th, when he met with Mr. and Mrs. Pope and explained he had to return to his hometown in Tennessee. He showed them a letter from his wife asking him to come home because one of their children was ill. When asked if Condy Dabney was in the boarding house the night of August 17th, the Popes explained they could not confirm whether any of their guests remained in their room all night. Mrs. Pope said she could confirm Condy Dabney's taxi was always parked in the yard when he was in the house, but she remembered it was not parked in the yard on the night of August 17th. Then came a bombshell that broke the case wide open. Marie Jackson walked into Sheriff Blair's office and told him she had a story to share that would help him solve the mystery of Mary Vickery's murder. The 19-year-old from Harlan told the sheriff that on August 17th, she and Mary Vickery were walking along the road between Coxton and Harlan. Condy Dabney was driving along, headed back to the train depot. Marie said she flagged down Dabney, and he pulled over. Marie Jackson explained she and Mary hired Dabney for a ride. Marie was in the front seat. Mary Vickery was in the back. Marie claimed that soon after they got in the car, Condy Dabney turned around and mentioned Mary Vickery was a very pretty girl, and he was going to have to go on a date with her. Marie was annoyed by Dabney's comments and asked to be dropped off at a restaurant in Harlan so she could eat dinner. Mary Vickery remained inside the taxi as Condy Dabney drove on. When Marie finished eating at the restaurant, she claimed she stepped outside and watched as Condy Dabney drove up with Mary Vickery now sitting in the front seat. Marie said Dabney stepped out of the taxi and told her Mary Vickery would only keep riding around with him if Marie got in the car with them. Now, Marie agreed and got in the back seat. It was late in the afternoon as they drove partway up the mountain and got out to walk a while. They ended up above the entrance to Bugger Hollow Mine, where they all sat down on a log and chatted for a bit. Marie said that after a while, Condy Dabney told her to go down the hill so he could talk to Mary alone. Marie did as she was told, walked down the hill, and sat in an area where she could look up and keep an eye on Mary Vickery with Condy Dabney. Marie watched as the man put his arm around Mary and tried to kiss her. And as she pulled loose from him, he grabbed a club from the ground and struck Mary Vickery over the head. Now, according to Marie Jackson's story, she saw Mary Vickery fall backwards and lay still. Condy Dabney cried out for Marie to come check on Mary, and when Mary reached them, she looked at the young girl and immediately knew she was dead. Marie then watched as Condy Dabney picked up Mary Vickery's lifeless body and carried her down into the abandoned mine. When Sheriff Blair questioned Marie, asked why she was just now coming forward after all this time, she explained she had remained quiet about what happened at Bugger Hill because Condy Dabney threatened to kill her. She had hurried away from the murder scene and left town for weeks. Once the body was found, she felt guilty, confessed what she knew to friends who encouraged her to immediately go to the sheriff. Marie Jackson's eyewitness testimony secured the grand jury indictment of Condy Dabney for murder in the first degree. Condy Dabney's trial began at Harlan on March 29, 1926, with a case that was based on the testimony of star witness Marie Jackson. When Marie took the stand, she held her head high, spoke confidently, and described the day she saw Condy Dabney murder Mary Vickery. Dabney's defense counsel attacked Marie Jackson's character, saying she was well known as a woman of questionable reputation in town, which was backed up by testimony from local police officers. The prosecution countered by calling jailhouse informant Claude Scott to the stand. Scott was an acquaintance of Marie Jackson, who claimed Condy Dabney offered him $15 to falsely testify that Marie Jackson lied about the murder story. Now, the defense answered this by pointing to the prosecution's overall weak case and the question of the identity of the victim's body. 5 witnesses were called to contradict Marie Jackson's testimony as to the timeline of the crime. Marie claimed she was with Mary Vickery and Condy Dabney from 7 a.m. until dark on August 17th, but the Stewart sisters testified they were with Mary during those afternoon hours on the day she disappeared. This was the afternoon the girls accepted a ride with Will Middleton and Otis King. Their account was corroborated by both of those men and the mother of the Stewart sisters. Then there was the question of the identification of the body of Mary Vickery, which was too badly decomposed to identify by appearance. The defense claimed decomposition was too extensive for the body to be that of someone who had been dead only a little more than a month. Condy Dabney took the stand in his own defense, saying he never knew Mary Vickery and was in no way involved in her murder. He acknowledged Marie Jackson had hired his taxi several times and had even tried to get him to leave his wife and children for her. But he said he had no idea why she would lie and say he murdered Mary Vickery. On March 31st, 1926, the jury returned a verdict of guilty with a recommendation of life imprisonment. Condy Dabney's defense filed a motion for a new trial, but it was quickly overruled. Following a failed appeal, Condy Dabney was sentenced to life in the state prison at Frankfort. It seemed the case was closed, mystery solved, until 1 year later, when a deputy sheriff checked into a hotel in Williamsburg on March 19, 1927. He noticed a familiar name in the hotel registry, Mary Vickery. He called in the local sheriff, who accompanied him to a room on the second floor. They knocked on the door and were greeted by a very pleasant young girl who had returned from the dead. There, standing in front of them, was Mary Vickery. She told the sheriff that on August 17, 1925, she ran away from home. She didn't feel safe at home anymore. There was that constant tension with her stepmother, so she hired a taxi that afternoon, was dropped off at the train station, and she started a new life. She used the name Rose Farmer for a while and had worked odd jobs in a few towns. Late in December, she heard she had been killed, and her taxi driver, Condy Dabney, had been sentenced to life. When the sheriff asked why she didn't let officials know she was alive, Mary Vickery simply said she just never thought about doing that. By mid-March 1927, Mary had saved up enough money to travel on to another town. She ended up in Williamsburg, where she became Mary Vickery again. The sheriff explained all that had happened back in Coxton, which further confused Mary Vickery, who said she didn't know Marie Jackson or Condy Dabney. She only learned Condy's name when she heard the news of a taxi driver going to prison for her murder. On March 20th, 1927, the young girl who had been traveling around while folks in Harlan County followed every detail of her alleged murder and the trial that followed, well, that girl stepped off a train in Harlan. She was accompanied by county deputies and led to the courthouse, where Marie Jackson had been called in to identify Mary Vickery in a lineup of 10 girls. Marie Jackson tried twice, but she could not identify Mary Vickery, the girl she claimed to know as a friend, the girl she claimed she watched die at the hands of Condy Dabney. Within a few days, a grand jury was convened to evaluate the Mary Vickery case. The judge stated the following: "A frightful travesty has recently been committed in Harlan County. It is of such a nature as to horrify even the most calloused. A man was indicted in this court on the charge of brutal murder and assault of a 14-year-old girl. This man is serving time in the penitentiary under a life sentence for murder of the girl who is alive and at the present moment here in Harlan." The jury decided the case upon the evidence of witnesses. One of these witnesses detailed the murder of the girl as an eyewitness. A more dastardly deed is inconceivable. To swear away the life of an innocent man is a crime for which the law, unfortunately, does not provide sufficient punishment. There can be nothing lower or more degraded than to make an innocent human being suffer the tortures of a trial, to hear perjurers swear his life away, to hear the verdict of a jury confining him to prison and misery for life. Marie Jackson admitted her motivation was revenge. Soon after Condy Dabney launched that taxi service, Marie did become one of his frequent customers. She was young, attractive, single, but she had a certain reputation in town. She set her sights on Dabney several times, but each time she tried to make a move on him, he rejected her. Condy Dabney promised his wife he would remain faithful while they were living apart, and he kept his word. Marie Jackson acknowledged she was a woman scorned. She vowed to get her revenge by walking into the sheriff's office and telling authorities she witnessed Condy Dabney murder Mary Vickery. Upon her confession, she was promptly indicted for perjury. On the anniversary of the day Condy Dabney was convicted of murder, Marie Jackson was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in the same prison that once held Condy Dabney. By the time Marie Jackson started her prison term, Condy had been transported from the prison to the State House, where he and his attorney met with Kentucky Governor William Fields. The governor signed Condy Dabney's pardon, and within minutes, he walked down the steps of the capital of Kentucky, a free man. When asked what was next, Condy Dabney said he was going back to digging coal because it seemed a whole lot safer than driving a taxi in Harlan County. Governor Fields demanded an investigation into the murder that never happened in Coxton. The case stirred up debate among legal scholars and locals as to how an innocent man could be convicted on almost no evidence. Marie Jackson later admitted in an interview she had intended to send Condy Dabney to the electric chair, but missed when he was only sentenced to life. When Marie was sentenced to prison for 5 years, The presiding judge made a point of telling her he wished he could give her more time. Following her release in early 1931, Marie Jackson was never seen in Harlan County again. The skeleton found in Bugger Hollow Mine was never positively identified. There was a theory that the skeleton was the remains of Letitia Cole, another young girl who vanished from the area about a year before Mary Vickery ran away from home. But that theory has never been proven. Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. You can find sources for this episode and learn more about the show at southernmysteries.com. If you'd like to support this independent podcast and help me continue to tell stories like Condy's, I'd invite you to join Southern Mysteries on Patreon. You have the option to join one of 2 tiers, which will get you access to ad-free episodes, along with the archive of the first 3 seasons of the show. You can also join at a level where you have access to the archives of patron-exclusive podcast and the monthly Patreon podcast, Audacious, tells us scandalous and shocking crimes in American history. You can check it out, start listening to episodes you haven't heard yet at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. Thanks for your support of the show, whether it is on Patreon or by rating and reviewing the podcast or sharing about it on your social channels. It all helps with discovery of the show so we can grow and share more stories with you. As always, thank you so much for listening.